Stay tuned for one of the most fascinating programs you'll ever hear as we explore the strange and mysterious world of the paranormal and UFOs. Welcome to the Paranet Continuum, a weekly program dealing with extraordinary claims of the paranormal on Earth and beyond. Whether or not you believe in the paranormal, the controversies are real, and this program will try to get to the bottom of it. Your host is Michael Corbin, Director of Paranet Information Services, a global communications network based near Denver, Colorado, dedicated to the investigation of parapsychology, futuristic science, and the UFO enigma. We invite you to keep an open mind as we discuss some of the most fascinating and strange subjects around. Now here's your host, Michael Corbin.
And good evening and welcome to this edition of the Paranet Continuum, home of common sense, no nonsense paranormal talk radio. with a guest, very interesting guest, and some of you people out there who are above the age of 40 will probably recall some of these events, but let's kind of recap. In towns throughout America, they came face to face with the ultimate evil. August 1969, Sharon Tate and 6 others are massacred northwest of Los Angeles by followers of Charles Manson. October 1974, Arliss Perry is the victim of a perverse ritual murder in a chapel on the Stanford University campus in California. February 1977, Fred Cowan murders 6 people before killing himself during a day-long siege at the Neptune Moving Company in New Rochelle, New York. July 1976 through August of 77, New York City is terrorized as the Son of Sam murders leave 6 dead and 7 wounded. February 1978, John Carr is found shot under questionable circumstances in Minot, North Dakota. October 1978, John's brother, Michael Carr, dies in a suspicious car accident in New York City. December 1981, Joseph Carrozza is shot twice with a .38 caliber revolver in New Rochelle, New York. July 1983, the long-dead corpse of missing movie producer Roy Radin turns up in a California desert. And November 1984, 16-year-old Teresa Fusco is abducted, raped, strangled, and dumped nude in a wooded area in Lynbrook, Long Island, and the evil one to kill again. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Gear Magazine, which has just come out with a piece titled The Ghost of 77, was written by my guest tonight, Maury Terry, who published a book called The Ultimate Evil. Now, Maury Terry is credited by law enforcement officials as being an expert on the Son of Sam case and on cult killings. He has researched and written more than 40 articles on the topic and has served as associate producer and on-camera host for 5 nationally syndicated television specials based on his work. And Terry won the 1982 United Press International's Enterprise Award for investigative reporting. He has also acted as a consultant in the Atlanta child murders investigation that occurred back in the 80s. And, of course, The Ultimate Evil was his very first book. And it's a pleasure to welcome to the program tonight, Maury Terry. Good morning, Maury.
Good morning, Michael. Nice to be with you.
I want to thank you for being with me at this ungodly hour over there in New York.
Well, it's payback for the people in Denver who were very nice to me back in
well, great.
1987 in the Rose Bowl, January the 25th. I'm a New York Giants fan. So
well, excellent. Well, thanks again for being on the program. As I told you earlier today when I talked to you, you're to be commended for your persistence and your perseverance in this very bizarre case that, as far as I'm concerned, I'm sure as far as you're concerned, has never been truly amiably resolved.
It has not been amiably resolved. What the case needs is a grand jury, and if a grand jury can be convened, I believe that the case at that point will be resolved. I think the case is basically solved. I think there's enough evidence to bring it to a grand jury, and hopefully that will happen at some point.
Okay. Now, before we get to the part about the article that appeared in Gear Magazine this month, let's go back a little bit in time here and kind of frame this for us. I started off by mentioning some of the trail of bodies, if you will, going back to 69 to Sharon Tate. Now, I know Sharon Tate was not involved directly with Berkowitz, but can you establish for us what took place and kind of give us a background on what happened?
In the Tate case?
No, actually in the Son of Sam case.
Oh, sure. Between July of 1976 and August of 1977, a series of homicides, attacks with nighttime attacks occurred throughout the boroughs of New York City. There were 8 different incidents, a total of 13 victims, 6 dead and 7 wounded.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the attacks occurred in lovers' lanes. All the victims were shot with .44 caliber gun. Many were in lovers' lanes. Others were young girls walking down the street by themselves, so on and so forth. The victims were all young, white, mostly female, and it evolved into the biggest case in New York history, and one of the biggest in modern American history, and became known as the Son of Sam shootings. And on August 10th of 77, a 24-year-old postal clerk by the name of David Berkowitz was arrested outside his apartment building in suburban Yonkers, just north of New York City. And Berkowitz confessed to doing all of the shootings and to doing them all by himself. And at the time when he was arrested, he claimed that a neighbor's dog, this may register with people, was really a demon and gave him the orders to kill and so on and so forth. And that's why he did it. And there was no trial. Berkowitz avoided a trial, pled guilty, was sent away, and that was supposedly the end of it. Only it wasn't. I began an investigation of it almost immediately after Berkowitz was arrested, and within almost 2 years' time, I began writing articles for the Gannett newspaper chain in Westchester County, north of New York City. And then the district attorney of Queens County, in which 5 of the 8 Son of Sam incidents occurred, reopened the case, and then went public stating he believed that Berkowitz, in fact, was part of a conspiracy. And that is sort of it in a nutshell. There have been a lot of developments over the years since then. Most recently, which the Gear magazine article covers, is that in 1996, the police in Berkowitz's hometown of Yonkers reopened the case quietly, ran a quiet investigation for 2 years to determine if Berkowitz was in fact part of a conspiracy that was concocted in their jurisdiction, and they have now determined that there is evidence indeed that he was part of such a conspiracy, and have recommended that the case go to a grand jury and the probe to be continued. Mm-hmm. That's where it stands as of this minute.
As of this minute. Now, your background as a journalist, is that correct?
Yes.
How did you start getting involved in this and realizing that something just wasn't ringing true?
Like many, many people in metropolitan New York back then, you couldn't avoid the case. It was all over the front pages. It dominated the headlines. Mm-hmm. TV news, radio news, day in and day out, and it was such a huge case. And I just became interested in it. And when Berkowitz got arrested, and a couple of comments that he allegedly made to the cops leaked out, things just didn't seem to add up. Like he would have had to have been in 2 places at once. In order to be the shooter, the police had released a series of artist drawings mm-hmm. of the so-called Son of Sam, and some of them were widely different than Berkowitz. And I started out with those kinds of troubles on my mind and started making inquiries, and within a short time I came up with some evidence that just convinced me to keep going, mm-hmm. and that led into other people in the case.
This is a very interesting case, I guess, because mostly I think because of the implications and the things that were involved. Now, going back to the beginning when I started off by going over the trail of bodies, if you will, what is the connection, or what was the connection between when you mentioned in your book Sharon Tate and the 6 that were massacred northwest of Los Angeles by followers of Charles Manson?
As it turns out, and this is the last thing I was looking for when I got into this case, as it turns out, Berkowitz was a member of a very sophisticated cult group that had come over from England in 1967. It was a satanic cult group, an Armageddon cult. It was known as the Process Church of the Final Judgment. Process landed in America in '67, established chapters in a number of U.S. cities, and were very active in California. And there is quite strong evidence that Charlie Manson himself had joined a Process cell in California, and in 1968. And here we go into 1977, 9 years later, and Berkowitz had also joined a Process operation in New York. So on different coasts at different times, the evidence is very, very strong that both Manson and Berkowitz had belonged to the same organization.
And the other interesting thing, too, that I think is brought up also in your article, the recent article in Gear Magazine, is the possible connection between the Process Church and Sirhan, who has been convicted and is serving time for the assassination of Robert Kennedy.
Yes, I've seen Ed Sanders, who back in the early 70s wrote an excellent book on the Manson murders called The Family, Vincent Bugliosi having written the other one called Helter Skelter. Sanders had unearthed some information strongly pointing toward the involvement of the Process in the Manson case. And he had also heard things about the possibility that Sirhan had in fact dabbled in Process activities. I found the same thing through a series of reports that were given to me to read. They were reports from the INS, in fact, and in it was stated that Sirhan, that witnesses had told the LA authorities that Sirhan had attended at least one Process sex ritual in the Los Angeles area. And there was another report that a Process member was actually a chef or a cook or an assistant cook in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel, which is, as we all know, is where Robert Kennedy was shot, right in that kitchen in that hotel.
As I recall, and I don't know if I remember this correctly, so maybe you may know and correct me if I'm wrong. Did not Robert Kennedy have dinner at the Tate house the night that he was killed?
Actually, I believe it was at the beachfront home in Malibu of Peter Lawford, who was a Kennedy brother-in-law, and that Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski were among the dinner guests. I see, okay. Which is kind of an interesting coincidence. I think it is a coincidence. It seems to be a coincidence.
Yeah. Maury, let's go kind of talk about the process, where it comes from, where it came from, where it had its origins, and how they got ever so entwined in our culture to be able to do what they've done.
The process, which still exists today under another name. There are a number of groups on the internet these days calling themselves the Process or Son of Process, but that's not the real Process. The real Process went underground, changed its name several times, and exists today under a benign name. But it began in 1963 as an offshoot of Scientology. The head of the Process, Robert de Grimston, and his wife, Mary Ann, in London, had been mid-level officials, I'd say, or counselors in Scientology, and had a falling out with L. Ron Hubbard, and went off to start their own group, which they called Compulsion Analysis at the beginning. And they recruited among some friends of theirs, and they were looking like all called stew for the wealthy recruits. And they gathered a group about them of such people in London, and it started to grow, and eventually they changed their name to the Process Church of the Final Judgment, because they were preaching Armageddon at the millennium, hence the Final Judgment, the name of the Final Judgment. And in 1967, a group of Process members came over to America, landed in America, established chapters first in New Orleans, then where they incorporated as an occult church, and that's right in their corporate papers, readily available, and branched out into Haight-Ashbury, then along the Sunset Strip, the perfect playground, New York City's Greenwich Village, the perfect places where they could find the type of the hippie element and all the rebellious young people that they were looking to recruit. And they arrived at a perfect time. It was the era of anti-Vietnam demonstrations. You had the free love, the Timothy Leary's turn on, tune in, drop out, rebellion against all authority, et cetera, and Process had fertile ground to plow in the counterculture of American youth of the late 1960s.
Particularly up there at Berkeley.
Yes, they had a chapter, and they were living right in Haight-Ashbury, and trying to recruit around Berkeley, and they had an address on Cole Street in the Haight, and they were only a block or so from where Manson was residing at the same time, and that was certainly his first exposure to them.
I find this all very fascinating because, as you mentioned, these places and these locations and the people that were, circulating around all of these things, they all feed into this in one way or the other.
Yeah, that's right. Process also was up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There,
around Harvard.
Right around Harvard. Again, they knew right where to go to get to try to recruit the kinds of people that they were looking for. Figuring, of course, where they would have the most success.
Mm-hmm.
And in New Orleans, they were right in the French Quarter.
In the French Quarter?
In New Orleans.
In New Orleans, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, we're going to take another break, and when we come back, we'll get more into into how they got entrenched in New York and how Berkowitz got involved with them, and what led to all of these bizarre, horrific murders. And again, this is a very interesting story. My guest is Maury Terry. We're talking to him about some late developments in the Son of Sam case. The Yonkers Police Department concludes a 2-year investigation that concludes that there was indeed a conspiracy, and David Berkowitz did not act alone. He was not the lone .44 caliber killer, as some people called him. This man was jailed for the Son of Sam murders that paralyzed New York, but did he really act alone? I'm referring to David Berkowitz, of course. A new police investigation may finally bring out the whole horrific truth, and we're talking with Maury Terry, who's in New York and who has been investigating this for many years, and through his persistence and perseverance is hopefully going to bring about, as he mentioned, a grand jury investigation, which may, of course, blow the lid off of this whole thing once and for all and bring it to an amiable close. Welcome back, Maury.
Welcome back. Nice to be here again, Michael.
Thank you. Now, let's talk about the reason I want to kind of talk about this too, because I think it has some relevance to today and some of the activities that we see in our culture today. And as Berkowitz mentioned on the A&E piece that you interviewed him in, he was under the influence of some kind of mind control. And is that correct?
Well, to the extent that that he was like many young people, not that they turn into killers, but there were many young people out there wandering around looking to belong to something. And it's a very old cliche. You've heard it many times, but when somebody's hungry, they'll take the bread from who's ever there to give it to them. And Berkowitz was drifting about, and he was vulnerable to the rap that was laid on him, all about how great the occult was, and it was a special thing to be a part of, and he was vulnerable enough to accept all of this. And as he did put it to me, once you get sucked into it, before too long, the tide's carrying you out to sea, and there's no way back to the shore, no matter how hard you may try to get back there. And that's what happened to him. There were a few factors in his life that made him susceptible to this, and they were able to get him to go out and believe in the religiosity part of this.
Right.
I mean, some of these people were in it for their own reasons, but Berkowitz and a number of others really believed in the religious side of this thing, and they thought they were on some sort of divine mission when they were out there doing these things.
It's incredible.
And this was all part of the Process rap. The Process people, if one knows their background, they are not the low-level people of society at all. When they came over from England, we're talking about university-educated people who led the Process. You had architects, accountants, a couple of people with stage backgrounds, and so on and so forth. Very, very intelligent people. And the problem is that they were also very bent and perverted themselves and lusted after power. And their idea was to recruit the David Berkowitzes of this world to go out and do their dirty work. At the same time, this devil stuff was really on the surface. They used it as a tool. But they were also operating a criminal enterprise. They were into providing young kids to the wealthy for sex parties and so on and so forth. And they had their connections and their hooks and their tie-ins and their ability to blackmail down the road some pretty kinky wealthy people. And they had friends in high places, in other words, and they provided a service to those friends. And so when they needed favors, they were able to get them. And as time has gone by over the years, as I've become to learn a lot more about how this Son of Sam / process operation worked, it's become very, very clear why they were able to get away with this in New York, and why when David Berkowitz got arrested and said, "Oh, a dog barked and I did it," and the lid went on the case, it's very, very obvious why that was allowed to happen, why there was no investigation to follow up on it, because Berkowitz's confession had more holes in it than you would find in a barrel of Swiss cheese, but they didn't care.
And we're going to get to that probably before we get done with you tonight. We're going to get to those reasons, because as you mentioned, they had their hooks into some very high level people.
They did indeed, and this, of course, I didn't know until the last couple of years how high up it went.
You know, that's very, very interesting, and I'll tell you, if I may quote the last two paragraphs of your article, I think that's the most chilling thing I've read in a long time. It says, the process, meanwhile, under a new name and a socially acceptable cover, as you just mentioned, is still functioning in 1998. Records show that the group has acquired millions of dollars in vast real estate holdings along the way in its quest to inspire Armageddon in time for its professed witching hour, the millennium. In other words, the process, to borrow a haunting phrase from a Son of Sam letter, is, quote, still here, like a spirit roaming the night. And that's chilling. You mentioned earlier that it's under a different name, a benign name. Is it a name that we would recognize?
It's a name that some people might recognize. I wish I could reveal it, but for obvious reasons, I can't.
But you say it's benign. It's something that nobody would ever suspect. Hello? What happened there? I don't know. Okay. We still on the air? Yes, we are. Okay, we're going to get him back. We're going to find out what happened to the connection. That was very, very odd, to say the least. While Brian is getting him back on. By the way, our number is 303-860-1280, 303-860-1280. And one of the things we got here that he's got in the article is it mentions, numerous names of people that have died as a result of this whole thing, and it's very, 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 very odd. Let's see if we're going to get him back in here, and I think we do have him. Again, our number is 303-860-1280, 303-860-1280, and we do indeed have him back. Let's try it back again. Maury, are you there?
Yes, Michael.
What happened? Do we know?
I have no idea. From where I was sitting, the line just went dead.
Yeah, just clicked off.
Just clicked off.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, let's go to, let's discuss the part about, I guess, where you entered into it with the first chapter of your book, The Ultimate Evil, was Satan at Stanford. There was a murder at Stanford of a young woman that was seemingly unconnected to all the goings-on in New York.
Yeah, her name was Arliss Perry. She was a native of Bismarck, North Dakota, young Christian bride, been a cheerleader and a member of various Christian organizations in Bismarck, married her hometown sweetheart named Bruce Perry. Ironic story about Bruce, too. And they then relocated to Palo Alto, where Bruce was studying at Stanford University to be a doctor. And they were only on the campus about 6 weeks when Arliss was found murdered in the Stanford Memorial Church. She was killed after midnight. Actually, it was this is almost the anniversary. It was the night of October 12th, 13th, 1974.
Mm-hmm.
And for about 5 years thereafter, the case was unsolved. I mean, technically it's still unsolved. And the Santa Clara Sheriff's Office thought they were searching for a local sexual psychopath. And then David Berkowitz, in 1979 from prison, dropped a note in which he mentioned some specifics about the Arliss Perry case, including polygraph keys, information that only the police would know.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got a hold of this letter, I had never heard of Arliss Perry, never heard of the case at all.
Mm-hmm.
And we soon found out what it was all about, and it turned out that the information Berkowitz had was absolutely correct and on the money. And I now know how Berkowitz came to know about that. He was at a cult meeting in New York in 1977 at a house in the Bronx, I believe, on City Island.
Mm-hmm.
One of the people who had been involved in Arliss Perry's killing was imported to New York to take part in the Son of Sam killings, and stood up at this cult meeting in this house and started bragging about the killing, and had Arliss's picture, and described what had happened to her. And Berkowitz, who has a remarkable memory, remembered that, and that's how he got the information that he later put into that letter.
Now, did anybody determine, I don't recall from reading the book, did anybody determine why Arliss Perry was selected?
Arliss Perry, Berkowitz didn't know the motive,
Mm-hmm.
but he knew there was a motive, that they went after her for a reason.
It wasn't just a random
No,
thing.
it was not. Arliss Perry had done something in her hometown of Bismarck to anger some people who were involved in a chapter of the cult group in North Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
And when she left to go to Stanford University, or to accompany her groom to Stanford University, they just didn't drop it. They tailed her to California, located where she was living in an apartment on the campus,
Mm-hmm.
and stalked her for a couple of weeks and set out to get her.
Now, you mentioned earlier, her husband had nothing to do with this, correct?
No, I mean, obviously her husband was the first suspect. The way this happened was they had an argument the night of the murder in the apartment, and she went out to take a walk and went to the church where she often went since she was a religious person. But of course, Bruce was the first suspect
Mm-hmm.
when they finally found the body. But very ironic about Bruce Perry. Bruce Perry went on to become a psychiatrist.
Really?
And in the Waco case a few years ago,
Yeah.
Bruce Perry is now connected to Baylor University. And Bruce Perry was one of the doctors who was counseling the young kids who had been released from the Waco compound by Koresh before the federal government assaulted and killed all those people.
Wow.
And Bruce Perry is, I don't know whether he's in a state of denial or what, but from what I understand, he appears at conferences just downplaying occult crime in general in the United States. And I just want to, when this information gets back to me, it surprises me, and I just write it off to, still a strong sense of denial
Mm-hmm.
about what really happened to his bride.
Wow. Hold that thought, Maury. We'll go to take another break. When we come back, we'll delve more into this interesting case. Maury Terry is my guest. We're talking about The Ultimate Evil, the book that he wrote back in the early 80s, I believe it was, and of course his recent article in Gear magazine concerning late developments in the Son of Sam case. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after this. My guest is Maury Terry. We're talking about David Berkowitz, the Son of Sam, and we are finding out, as Maury Terry has been maintained for many years, that David Berkowitz did not act alone. We're going to find out tonight why David Berkowitz why Maury Terry says that David Berkowitz did not act alone. It's because there's some very interesting developments over the years, as you've heard Maury mention. And Maury, we've got about probably about 3-4 minutes before the network news. Let's talk about how your investigation went beyond Arliss Perry. What took you to North Dakota? Because that's a bizarre story as well.
Well, the North Dakota connection at first was because of one of the people who Berkowitz has now named as a co-conspirator and actually as one of the shooters in the case. His name was John Carr. He was the son of Berkowitz's neighbor, Sam Carr, hence the term son of Sam. Literally, John Carr and his brother Michael were the sons of Sam. And John Carr surfaced as an immediate suspect of mine in the case right after Berkowitz was arrested because of an alias used in the Son of Sam letter that happened to be John Carr's nickname. And if, as the police maintained at the time, Berkowitz didn't know the Carrs at all, well, how would he know the nickname of a guy who spent all his time in North Dakota? But
Correct.
he did. And so I went looking for John Carr, and 6 months after Berkowitz was arrested, I found John Carr because he was shot dead in Minot, North Dakota, in his girlfriend's apartment on Minot Air Force Base. They first called it a probable homicide, then changed it to an apparent suicide, and then it went back to a most likely homicide. And I can tell you it's been proven that it was a homicide. So somebody went out to shut John Carr up within months of Berkowitz's arrest, and Berkowitz has since told me that John Carr was the weakest link because he had a bad drug and alcohol problem. And if anybody was the likely one to crack, it would have been John Carr. Of course, Berkowitz was in jail at the time, but he said that's why they would have gone after John, because he was the weakest.
Now, where did Berkowitz get the idea to use the dog? Was that that was concocted by him and a few of his accomplices near the very, very end of the case, shortly before he got arrested, and that was just to lay the foundation for an insanity defense, which Berkowitz later, before he pled guilty in court, abandoned that and admitted it was nonsense. But that's the thing, first impressions count, and that's the thing that thing with the dog has stuck in the minds of many people for many years. I mean, it's the most ludicrous story absolutely
that you could imagine, and why the authorities accepted it is beyond belief, and it just leads into other areas. But interesting thing about the dog, if there's a minute, the name of the dog was Harvey was the dog's name, the talking dog, right? Well, interestingly enough, and this shows you how devious some of these people are, they got, in that movie, James Stewart talked to the rabbit. Talking rabbit, the invisible rabbit that only James Stewart could see. The rabbit's name was Harvey.
Oh, no.
That's where the idea came from.
So they just grabbed this stuff out of the air. Now,
absolutely. That's exactly what they did.
Wow. And
the biggest, and the so-called New York's finest and all was suckered into this like they were, the Hardy Boys at the age of 2 or 3 and had no knowledge about anything. It's just pathetic.
That's wild. And welcome back. 62 degrees in Denver, 106 in the morning, and of course in New York, where my guest Maury Terry is, it's much later. And I want to thank you, Maury, for being with us.
That's okay. My pleasure, Michael.
At this ungodly hour.
For some.
Yeah. Okay, let's kind of pick up where we left off. We're talking again with Maury Terry, who wrote a book. When was the book published, Maury?
Hardcover, summer of '87, updated for paperback in the fall of '89.
'89, and the book was called The Ultimate Evil, and it is, in my opinion, it's the concise history of a very bizarre string of murders in the New York area that stretch out, as you've been hearing, all the way to the West Coast. And we're talking with Maury Terry about recent developments in the case, and an article that he has published in Gear magazine, which is available in all, I picked mine up here in Denver, and it's available in all major stores and magazine shops. And Maury, let's go back to New York. Let's get back to New York after.
I'm already here, Mike.
Okay.
You go back to New York.
Okay. Let's go to talk about how this case unfolds, and Berkowitz is ultimately arrested. Now, originally, people thought that he had basically, took commands from a dog that was demon-possessed, and you have discovered, or a lot of people have discovered, the police even knew this at the time, that the whole arrest was arranged, wasn't it?
The police didn't know at the time that the arrest was really a setup, but yes, we've come to know that it was a setup. Another example of some of the vileness in the manner of thinking that goes on with some of the people involved in this. I mean, Berkowitz's apartment, which was set up to look like the lair of a madman, was indeed set up several days before his arrest. His apartment was a very normal apartment in a nice building overlooking the Hudson River about 17 miles north of Midtown Manhattan. Mm-hmm. And in the dead of night, Berkowitz, assisted by 3 other people, cleared out, rented a U-Haul van, cleared out his furniture, and deposited it in front of a Salvation Army warehouse in a community about 6 miles away. Left it right in front of the building. And then on the very day of his arrest, 2 other people, one of whom is named in this article for the first time, his name was John DeFrenza, and along with another guy named Richie, came over and took out some last-minute stuff, Berkowitz's mail and so on and so forth, some last-minute items. And that was literally hours before the police arrived to arrest Berkowitz. Berkowitz knew the cops were on the horizon. He knew they were coming imminently. And he knew it because the night before the arrest, the cops in New York City were checking a parking ticket that had been put on his car at the last Son of Sam crime scene out in Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. And it was a routine call to the Yonkers Police Department. They thought Berkowitz might have been a witness to it. They had no idea that Berkowitz was involved in anything because they were looking for a yellow VW as the killer's getaway car, and Berkowitz was driving a full-size Ford Galaxy, which had been ticketed a couple of blocks from the crime scene for parking too close to a hydrant. Mm-hmm. So they're just doing a routine check of potential witnesses. And they actually, the New York City cops, actually tried to call Berkowitz at home, which I find amusing if he was home and answered. What would he have told them, you know? They did. And they got lazy. He didn't answer the phone, so they decided to let the Yonkers cops do their work for them. Mm-hmm. So they called Yonkers and to say, why don't we have somebody call Berkowitz or knock on his door and ask him to give us a call. Well, lo and behold, who answers the phone at Yonkers Police Department? But the daughter of Sam Carr, the sister of John Carr and Michael Carr. She has the unusual name of Wheat Carr. She was a civilian dispatcher for the Yonkers PD. Mm-hmm. So here was New York calling up saying, yeah, would you send somebody up to ask Berkowitz to give us a call? And she goes right into her act. Berkowitz, oh, him, we think he shot our dog. He's this, he's that. We think he's the Son of Sam. So suddenly, potential witness Berkowitz went to the top of the list as a possible suspect. And the very next day, New York went up and arrested him. But since the call came to, coincidentally, Wheat Carr, of course, she immediately told her brothers. Berkowitz was tipped off, and Richie and John DeFrenza go over and take out some last-minute stuff the next morning, and there's Berkowitz when the cops come out and arrest him outside his building that night. And, many people wondered why Berkowitz had this enigmatic grin on his face when he was escorted into police headquarters in front of all of the cameras.
Right.
Now I know why he did. Now I know why he did.
Was she involved? Was she involved in this whole deal? Maybe.
I'd say that it's fair to say that she is under intense scrutiny.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. We'll take that up after the break, and we'll kind of come up to the present day and the thing that has led to Maury's article in Gear Magazine. Remember, my guest is Maury Terry, and we're talking about the infamous Son of Sam case, and something that occurred back in the late 70s, middle 70s, late 70s in New York. And it's an incredible story. And, of course, Maury Terry has been on it and developing quite a bit of material over the years. And, Maury, let's talk about the stuff that's developed since Berkowitz was convicted and has been in prison. You've developed quite a bit of wild information that kind of leads, like you mentioned earlier, to very high places.
Yeah, I mean, when I did The Ultimate Evil, information alluding to the upper levels of society, mm-hmm. There was information in the book about that in the late 80s, but it wasn't specific information because I didn't have specific information. I was dealing through a handful of prison informants who had gotten close to Berkowitz, and he told them certain things. And but since I've been able to sit down with Berkowitz, which started in 1993, mm-hmm. a lot of other very specific information has been developed as to who these people were. Other informants have come forward. There's a guy who was involved with the process, who's in prison in the South today. He's mentioned in that article. His name is Jesse Turner. Jesse Turner provided very, very specific information about the process and their hooks into the upper levels of society, both in New York and what they were doing in New Orleans, which is where Turner spent almost 2 years with them, and he later hooked up with them again in New York.
Mm-hmm.
So between the various sources of information over the last few years, very specific evidence has been developed pointing to exactly how this whole setup worked and how they were able to get away with it and what types of people were involved on the upper levels. And there were 2 aides to New York City's mayor at the time, Abraham Beame.
Mm-hmm.
There was a then Yonkers judge. There were a couple of Westchester County, which is where Yonkers is, the county just north of New York City, politicians, and there were a couple of New York State level politicians involved with this group. And by that, I want to emphasize, I don't mean that they were sitting down planning the murders with them, but they were in the social circles with this group. They were at sex parties together. The people I'm alluding to had a thing for young kids, and young kids were provided at these parties.
God.
And when Berkowitz got arrested, you can see why people like this would be scurrying around and using their old boy network behind the scenes to make sure the case wasn't pursued further,
Mm-hmm.
because it would lead right into their twisted lives. I was shocked at how high up it went. I'm not shocked that top-level officials some of them are into young kids. That doesn't shock me.
Mm-hmm.
But it just shocked me that it was so in this case, and how wide the net was spread in order to keep the lid, I'm mixing metaphors, on the case.
Right. The thing that appalls me, and I don't know if you know Senator John DeCamp, but
I'm certainly familiar with the case. I read a book that came out about that.
It was called
so on and so forth.
It was called the Franklin Cover.
Yes, out of Nebraska, right?
That's right. I interviewed the gentleman a couple of months ago on my program, and it just was. Number one, it was sickening. I mean, to me, you say you're not surprised, but of course, after the investigation that you've been involved in, I understand. But it just blew me away to hear of the kind of stuff that was going on. But the thing I wonder is, how does this kind of thing happen, and how do people at these levels get involved in something as heinous and horrific as this?
There's the Paul Revere and the Raiders song from 1966, which I always thought says so much, and the name of the song was Kicks, and it was Kicks Just Keep Getting Harder to Find.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of these people, when they have the money, when they have the power, they've done everything, and they keep looking for the next thrill. What'll turn me on next? And some of them, it eventually leads into sex with kids and snuff films and so on and so forth.
Good heavens.
Because they have done everything else. I mean, there was a snuff film, and I put Berkowitz on TV, confirming this, made of the last Son of Sam shooting.
Right, I remember seeing that on the art.
They made a damn movie of it.
And they were selling it.
It's a real collector's item. It's one of those things like you hear about valuable pieces of artwork being
Mm-hmm.
stolen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they don't exactly advertise in magazines saying, buy this, but there are collectors who will pay a fortune just to have a valuable stolen piece of art,
Yeah.
And it was this way, as I understand it, with the Son of Sam snuff film, that there were a handful of copies made, and that they went for an awful lot of money.
One of the names that came up in the A&E piece that you're referring to was Robert Mapplethorpe.
Yeah, Robert Mapplethorpe, again, a friend of this individual named Jesse Turner, who's presently in jail for bank robbery, who I mentioned a few minutes ago. Turner and Mapplethorpe had known each other very well. Turner actually lived with Mapplethorpe when Mapplethorpe, in the early 70s, was dating and living with Patti Smith, the well-known rock singer.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Turner was living with them in another bedroom in the apartment. Mapplethorpe was mostly gay, but whatever he did with Patti Smith, I don't know. But that's why, and Mapplethorpe was involved with the process. And Mapplethorpe, as if people are familiar with him, may know, was one of the real kings of kink. I mean, his photography and his artwork, it all was homoerotic to the nth degree, and scandalous to the minds of many, many people. And there was a big furor, I believe, in the late 80s when the National Endowment for the Arts funded a display of his work, or an exhibit of his work in Cincinnati, and there was all sorts of repercussions because it was called just outrageous stuff. But Turner had been involved with process, and so was Mapplethorpe. And when they wanted this Son of Sam movie back, the word was passed through Mapplethorpe. Can you find somebody who will go get this film back from the guy who's got a copy of it? And Turner said to Mapplethorpe, sure. And he recruited two guys who went into this brownstone in Manhattan on Halloween of '81 and got the film and killed the guy. Ronald Sisman, his name was, along with a young college co-ed who was in Sisman's brownstone at the time, and took off with the film. And according to Turner, that film and four others were then sent to Mapplethorpe's post office box in Lower New York City by the gunman who did it. Now, 2 years ago, just 2 years ago, the New York City cops hauled in these two alleged gunmen who were named by Turner. One of them blew the needle off the poly machine. He was lying so badly, and the other was caught 4 times trying to beat the machine. The two of them then hired lawyers, and that case right now is at a stalemate. There were detectives in the NYPD who wanted to keep going with this, but when the top of the department learned that this was leading right into the Son of Sam case, they put the lid on it.
Wow. Now, and of course, this is was this referred to in the video piece? That was this referring to the part where the NYPD had opened the investigation? And then
that's exactly what it was. And Ronald Sisman, who was murdered there in his brownstone in '81, along with the co-ed, Sisman was actually the guy in the van at the last Son of Sam scene who was running the camera. They had a van parked across the street. There were 3 people in it. I know the identities of all 3. Sisman was one of them. And Sisman, they whacked to get the film back, in his copy of the film back in '81. One of the other people in the van was a very close associate of somebody you mentioned earlier in this program, named Roy Radin, who was another kinky guy with a ton of money from Southampton, Long Island, who was trying to enter the movie business as a producer and was murdered over the film The Cotton Club in Los Angeles, outside of L.A., in 1983. And the third person in the van was, well, okay, I'll leave the third person out of it. Okay.
Okay. The thing is that what your investigation has taken you, as you mentioned, Roy Radin, for example.
I'll tell you something about Roy Radin. The person who, one of the people involved in Radin's murder was also a shooter in the Son of Sam case.
Now, is that the guy that's now in prison that was dubbed Manson too?